Okay, good morning or afternoon or whatever it is to everybody. Thanks very much, as Kirsten said, for listening in. Firstly, I'm going to start off just by explaining my credentials, I suppose, to present on this subject. So my career in tech, PR and marketing has been almost actually over a quarter of a century now. So I've worked both in-house for a variety of technology companies in the first half of my career, with responsibility for budgets and needing to deliver results against those budgets. And the second part of my career has been within éclat marketing, where our focus is very much on helping companies to build their brand both in the UK and into Europe. Our agency was actually founded back in the late 1990s during the dot-com boom. So we have a huge amount of experience of working with US companies. In fact, the agency was actually established with a specific idea of helping companies to be able to, those companies who usually had some kind of existing presence in the US market, but we're looking to establish a leading profile in the UK and then moving across Europe. And that was really why we originally developed the idea of newshound PR. We felt that there was a gap in the market for a specialist technology agency that had independent agencies that all had a real depth and breadth of understanding both in technology and in helping companies that were launching for the first time into this market. And over the 15 years that éclat has been in operation, we have helped literally dozens of companies, both working with them to launch them into Europe and working with them through the whole journey, shall we say, through building that brand to IPO or to acquisition. So moving on then to the next slide. In thinking about what I could present in just 10 minutes really, I thought perhaps the easiest approach would be to look at distilling down that experience over 15 years and try and pinpoint what are the top 10 most common mistakes or misconceptions that companies that are looking to launch into Europe for the first time make. These aren't in any particular order, but hopefully they will help you to avoid making some of those mistakes if you're thinking about planning a launch into Europe. So if you could move on to the next slide, please. So the first issue is one of budget, and very often people underestimate the cost of doing PR in Europe, or think that it can be handled centrally out of the US. And this is really this is a false economy. In order to really build a brand in Europe, you need to invest in the region and build a strong presence in each of the different diverse markets. As I'm sure you're all aware, Europe is not one country with one set of media. It's a region of rich diversity with multiple languages, different cultures, economies, very different markets. And really, if you're going to be seen as a player in those markets, you need to think individually and develop strategies for each of those countries in order to be successful. You need to make sure that you have local presence in the markets. If you want to be seen as a player in the UK market, for example, you need to have a point of reference. You need to have a spokesperson, ideally, a channel if you're selling through the channel, and you need to have some proof points. But it also varies depending on whether, in terms of who you're targeting. So some of you may be targeting the enterprise market, and it's certainly true when you're looking at the enterprise market that you need to be addressing that on a country-by-country basis. Or the consumer market, you need to be thinking about the individual media that are read in the different countries. However, if you're looking at, for example, mobile operators or broadcasters or broadband service providers, then it's a different story, and there is a different media which does have a more pan-European or international approach. So there is no one-size-fits-all approach for this, and you have to think about it in the context of who you're looking to reach out to. It's also worth pointing out that the cost isn't the cost of individual PR activities in different markets isn't even necessarily related to the size of that market. So as an example, Sweden can cost you as much to tackle as a market as, say, the UK or Germany. This is because the cost of employing PR professionals in this market is higher. So you have to look at each individual market and evaluate the cost versus the reward of investing in those markets. Of course, you also have the factor of exchange rate fluctuations, which can also have a bearing on this issue. So moving on to the next myth or mistake, shall we say, one of the most common difficulties, I guess, that we have is in terms of the timing. So can we move forward to the next slide? Right. It's very common for us to receive requests from US companies to launch their products during an industry exhibition. And it was only really probably relatively recently that I understood why this was such a common request. And it's because in the US, it's widely recognized that being such a large country, the prime time for journalists and analysts to meet up with vendors is at these shows. Therefore, that is the expectation. And events like RSA, for example, the security show in the US, are opportunities for the press and analysts and vendors very much to get together. However, in the UK and Europe, this really isn't the case. And because we're smaller countries, it's much more likely that we will organize meetings with the press at, say, a venue in London or Munich or Paris. We don't need to do this at shows. In fact, on the contrary, exhibitions are the worst time to launch your product or your company. And that's for three very good reasons. The first of these is that you will then be competing with all of the established big players in the industry. That's very hard if you're starting out as a new brand in the market to compete with. The second is that the media, the European media, tend to view exhibitions as an opportunity to meet with people or listen to people that they cannot meet with at any other time of the year. And therefore they tend to want to go to the conferences or listen to industry luminaries that aren't otherwise accessible. And the third reason is that it isn't a great time necessarily if you're investing. It's hugely expensive to go to these shows, and you probably will find that your executives would rather spend their time talking to prospects than talking to media. For that reason, our recommendation is generally, if you want to build traction ahead of an exhibition, start working on this, say, 3 months before the exhibition. Moving on to the next slide. The third most common mistake, should we say, or misconception or difficulty is in this balance between control and consistency. Of course, you want to make sure that you've got consistency in messaging. As we all know, it's very much a global market. However, if you really want to optimize the opportunity that breaking news stories present for great media traction and to give your spokespeople the opportunity to build that thought leadership basis, then you really need to devolve a level of autonomy to the local spokespeople, if at all possible. That's because the news agenda is so fast moving that a story which is breaking in the morning, you probably have 2 hours in which to turn around a comment and really get that out to the key media before the agenda has moved on. And that's very challenging for East Coast companies and virtually impossible for West Coast companies. So therefore, without having that autonomy for the local spokespeople, then you do miss out on a huge amount of local exposure. Moving on to the fourth or problem, shall we say, and that's the one of localization. If you are going to be seen as a global player, you need to have local agency support, feet on the ground that are speaking the local language, that have relationships with the local press, that you can leverage. There is this common misconception that because English is a common language that the US and the UK share, that it's perfectly acceptable and advisable to use a US agency to launch into the UK. That is not the case. Today it is very much about leveraging relationships. It's about being able to respond to breaking news stories in the same time zone. It's being able to know about local trends and issues in order to flag them and make them relevant to your stories. So take an example, the EU data protection regulations, for example, a very big story that it's very important that clients are aware of and able to offer comment on. Moving on then to the fifth, I'm conscious of time here. This is looking at the issue of planning globally. In days gone by, when we used to have print publications, it was perfectly possible to launch a product or a service or an announcement in one country and for there to be a delay before that had to be announced elsewhere. Today, of course, that is completely not the case. News is published globally. Large publishers like CNET will have a follow the sun approach to news, and the journalist writing up the news could be based anywhere but will get exposure on a global level. For that reason, it's very important when you're planning your PR activity to consider the global impact, looking at the timing, so making sure that when you make your announcement, it isn't a bank holiday in one of your key markets, it doesn't coincide with a major trade show, and just thinking about the actual time of day that you're going to be putting out these announcements. All of these things are important, as well as making sure that you build in time to translate your material into local language. So those are the kind of 5 key points. Just moving on to my last slide before I hand over. So if that's all the things that you need to avoid, you may well be asking, so what are you advising that we do? So this is just a very brief checklist. So first of all, think very carefully about the agencies that you're going to be working with, and make sure that they really do know your market very well and they have experience of launching a company into their marketplace. These require different skills to managing an established and well-known brand. So launching a company from scratch really means you have to break down some doors and in order to get you in front of the right people. Think very carefully about the countries and the order in which you're going to be launching. It may not be the best approach to try and simultaneously launch in all of the markets. It may be best to start in one and branch outwards. So consider all of these things very carefully. Consider what assets you have, what proof points you have, what references you have in the individual countries to really make a success. And consider when, as we've already emphasized, it's make sure that the launch time is optimal for all countries. Sweden and the Nordic countries go on holiday in July. In France, they go in August. The Brits go at any time between July and August. So think about the timing and make sure that you have really given yourself the best chance of getting global exposure. And work with your agency to build localized messaging and proof points and facts and figures and references so that you really have a solid local story to tell. Think very carefully about the news hook. If you're unknown, you won't be able to rely on your brand to get you in front of the right people. So you really need a strong story that's of genuine interest for that marketplace, not a product pitch, I hasten to add. Finally, make sure that you are constantly reviewing and looking at learning from what you're doing. if you have a coordinated pan-European agency approach, it's certainly possible to share materials and learnings between agencies so that you really do have a virtual agency working for you. I think I'm out of time now, so that's all for me now, but hopefully that's given some thought and food for thought and help you perhaps avoid making some of the mistakes that other companies have made.